The day Vivian Carter arrived in Timber Ridge, three men placed bets on how long she would survive before fleeing back to civilization, and not one of them wagered more than a week. Pacific Northwest, Oregon Territory, year 1892. The logging camps of the Cascade Mountains stood as monuments to human ambition and natural grandeur, where Douglas fir trees rose like cathedral spires toward heaven, their trunks so massive that 10 men holding hands could barely encircle them, and their canopy so dense that sunlight reached the forest floor in scattered fragments, like broken promises. Here in these green cathedrals of timber and stone, fortunes were carved from the wilderness, with cross-cut saws and raw determination, where the scent of fresh-cut pine mingled with the sweat of laborers, and where the thunder of falling giants echoed through valleys that had known only silence since the dawn of time. The stagecoach that carried Vivian Carter up the treacherous mountain road seemed determined to shake her bones loose from her body, rattling over ruts carved deep by timber wagons, hauling their massive loads down to the mill town below. Through the dusty window, she glimpsed towering evergreens that dwarfed anything she had ever seen in Boston, their bark thick as castle walls, their branches heavy with the weight of centuries. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed, carrying the sharp scent of resin and damp earth, and something else she could not name, something wild and untamed that spoke of places where civilization had barely left its mark. She wore a traveling dress of deep emerald wool, tailored in the latest Boston fashion, with pearl buttons that caught the filtered sunlight, and a hat adorned with peacock feathers that now hung slightly askew from the violent journey. Her gloved hands clutched a leather medical bag that had belonged to her late husband, its surface worn smooth by his touch, the only inheritance besides debt and bitter memories that Dr. Thomas Carter had left behind when fever took him 18 months ago, leaving her alone in a world that had little use for educated widows without fortune or family connections. The position as camp nurse and school teacher had arrived like Providence itself, advertised in the Boston Globe with promises of decent wages and mountain air beneficial to those seeking fresh starts. What the advertisement had not mentioned was the isolation, the skepticism with which outsiders were viewed, or the particular challenges facing a refined woman in a world built by and for men whose lives revolved around the brutal business of bringing down forest giants. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in what could only generously be called the town center of Timber Ridge, a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered around a muddy main street, where timber wagons stood loaded with logs so enormous they seemed impossible to have been cut by human hands. The air thrummed with the distant sound of saws biting into wood, the rhythmic crack of axes meeting their marks, and the shouted commands of men orchestrating the controlled fall of trees that had stood since before Columbus sailed toward unknown shores. As she descended from the coach, her fashionable boots sinking immediately into mud that clung like tar, Vivian felt the weight of hostile stares from every direction. Men paused in their work to observe her arrival with expressions ranging from amusement to outright disdain. Women peered from windows with narrowed eyes that measured and found her wanting, their work-worn faces showing no welcome for this overdressed stranger who clearly had no understanding of mountain life. A thin man with tobacco-stained teeth approached, introducing himself as Clayton Morris, foreman of the camp operations. His gaze traveled from her elegant hat to her impractical boots with undisguised contempt. "So you're the nurse from Boston," he said, his tone making clear what he thought of both her profession and her origins. "I hope you brought sturdier shoes than those, Miss Carter. This ain't no parlor." "Mrs. Carter," she corrected gently, her voice carrying the educated diction that would mark her as an outsider every time she spoke. "And yes, I came prepared for practical work, Mr. Morris." His laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Well, see about that. Come on then, he'll show you to your quarters, don't expect much. This ain't the Waldorf Hotel." He led her through mud and sawdust to a small cabin at the edge of the settlement, its logs weathered grey by mountain winters, its single window clouded with grime. Inside, the space was barely larger than a prison cell, containing a narrow cot, a potbelly stove that looked as though it hadn't been cleaned in years, and a table with one broken leg propped up by a stack of mouldy books. The air smelled of mildew and mouse droppings, and when she set down her bag, dust rose in clouds that made her cough. "Meals are in the main hall at dawn, noon, and sunset," Morris said from the doorway. "Miss your time. You go hungry. The schoolhouse is the building with the bell. 23 children need teaching when they're not working. The infirmary is attached, such as it is. Supplies are limited, so don't waste nothing. Any questions?" "Many," Vivian replied, "but I suspect he'll find my own answers." He grunted and departed, leaving her alone in the dim cabin with only the distant sounds of the logging camp for company. She sat on the cot, which creaked ominously under her weight, and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of despair before straightening her spine and beginning to unpack. She had not come this far, had not left behind the suffocating sympathy and whispered gossip of Boston society, to be defeated by a dirty cabin and hostile strangers. As evening fell across Timber Ridge, painting the massive trees in shades of purple and gold, Vivian ventured out to explore her new home. The settlement consisted of perhaps 40 buildings scattered among stumps that stood like gravestones, marking where giants had fallen. The main street, if it could be called that, was flanked by a general store, a blacksmith shop, a massive cookhouse that could feed hundreds, and the company office, a 2-story structure that looked almost civilized compared to the rough cabins surrounding it. She walked past groups of loggers heading to supper, their clothes stained with pitch and sawdust, their faces weathered by wind and sun until age became impossible to determine. They fell silent as she passed, then erupted in laughter once they thought her out of earshot. She caught fragments of their commentary, none of it kind, much of it questioning her sanity for coming to such a place, more of it making crude speculations about how long her delicate sensibilities would last. The schoolhouse stood near the edge of the clearing, its bell tower listing slightly to one side. Through dirty windows, she could see rough benches and a battered desk, maps on the walls that showed territories that no longer existed under those names, and a shelf of books so worn their titles had faded to illegibility. The attached infirmary was even more depressing, containing 6 narrow cots, a cabinet with broken doors revealing medical supplies that looked to be mostly empty bottles and rusted instruments. As she stood contemplating the monumental task before her, a voice spoke from behind, deep and resonant as distant thunder. "That building hasn't seen a proper teacher in 3 years." Vivian turned and found herself looking up, then further up, at a man whose sheer size made her breath catch in her throat. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block the sunset, dressed in wool trousers held up by leather suspenders, and a flannel shirt rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle. His face, partially shadowed by the fading light, showed the weathering of outdoor life, but his eyes, dark as old-growth forest shadows, held an intelligence that surprised her. "Then it's past time it did," she replied, refusing to be intimidated by his size or the power that radiated from him like heat from a forge. "I am Mrs. Vivian Carter, the new teacher and nurse." "I know who you are," he said simply. "The whole camp knows. Word travels fast when something unusual arrives. Elias Blackwood. I own this operation." She had heard the name, of course. Blackwood Timber was one of the largest operations in the territory, rumored to be making its owner a millionaire many times over, but she had not expected the owner to be here, in this remote camp, covered in sawdust like any common laborer. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "I hope my work will prove satisfactory." His gaze held hers for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he could see through all her carefully constructed defenses to the uncertainty beneath. "Time will tell, Mrs. Carter. Mountain life breaks most people who weren't born to it. No shame in that. But it does a body no favors to pretend otherwise. I don't pretend anything, Mr. Blackwood. I simply do what needs doing." Something that might have been approval flickered in his dark eyes. "Then you'll do fine, or you'll die trying. Either way, I expect you'll make it interesting." He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a gesture that wasn't quite a salute and walked away into the gathering darkness, his footsteps making no sound despite his massive frame. That night, lying on the lumpy cot listening to mice skitter in the walls and the distant sounds of men laughing in the bunkhouses, Vivian allowed herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what she had undertaken. But she also remembered the stifling drawing rooms of Boston, the pitying looks, the assumption that a widow without means had no future worth mentioning. Here, at least, she would live or fail on her own merits. Here, perhaps, she could become someone other than Thomas Carter's unfortunate widow. In the darkness, she whispered a prayer to no one in particular, and promised herself that tomorrow she would prove she belonged here, or she would die trying. Morning in Timber Ridge arrived not with gentle dawn, but with the violent clang of a bell that shattered sleep like an axe through rotten wood, summoning loggers to the cookhouse before the sun had cleared the mountain peaks. Vivian rose in the darkness, washing her face in water so cold it stole her breath, and dressed in the most practical clothing she had brought, a simple skirt of sturdy brown wool and a white shirtwaist that buttoned to her throat. She braided her auburn hair into a crown that would stay secure through a day's work, and made her way through mud and morning mist to the cookhouse, where hundreds of men were already attacking their breakfasts with the focused intensity of those who knew they would burn every calorie before noon. The hall fell silent as she entered, dozens of eyes tracking her movement to the serving line, where a woman old enough to be her grandmother regarded her with open hostility. "You must be the Boston lady," the woman said, her tone making lady sound like an insult. "This ain't no tea party, girl. You eat what you're served and be grateful for it." "I expect nothing else, ma'am," Vivian replied evenly, accepting the tin plate piled with fried potatoes, thick slabs of bacon and bread that was more dense than any she had encountered. She found a seat at the end of a long table, very aware of the space that opened around her, as men deliberately chose seats elsewhere, leaving her isolated as surely as if she carried plague. The food was heavy and unseasoned, but plentiful, designed to fuel men engaged in backbreaking labor from dawn until dark. She ate methodically, refusing to show any reaction to either the food or the hostility surrounding her. When she rose to return her plate, she nearly collided with a woman perhaps 10 years her senior, wearing a dress of expensive fabric that seemed as out of place in this rough hall as Vivian's peacock feathers had been. "So you're the new teacher," the woman said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated far from these mountains. "I am Constance Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood's cousin, and the person who manages the civilized aspects of this operation. I trust you'll find everything adequate." There was something in the woman's smile that reminded Vivian of a knife blade catching light, all gleaming surface and sharp edges. "Adequate for the work, certainly," Vivian replied carefully. "I look forward to meeting the children." Constance's pale eyes, the color of winter ice, studied her with undisguised assessment. "The children here are not like the pampered darlings you knew in Boston, Mrs. Carter. They work from the time they can walk. School is a luxury their parents barely tolerate. I suggest you remember that before you fill their heads with useless Eastern notions. I believe all knowledge has value, Miss Blackwood." "It's Mrs. Blackwood," the woman corrected coldly. "Though my husband is deceased, and you will find that belief tested quickly here. We have no use for impractical dreamers who cannot adapt to reality." Before Vivian could respond, Constance swept away, leaving a trail of expensive perfume that clashed with the smells of bacon grease and timber smoke. Vivian stood for a moment, understanding with perfect clarity that she had just been warned, that Constance Blackwood saw her as some kind of threat and had no intention of making her transition easy. The schoolhouse, when she opened its doors to the morning light, was even more depressing than she had imagined. Benches were carved with initials and crude drawings. The floor was littered with mouse droppings and sawdust, tracked in from outside, and the potbelly stove in the corner looked as though it might collapse if anyone attempted to light it. But the morning sun, streaming through the dirty windows, revealed something else, shelves of books that, while worn, included volumes of poetry, mathematics, history, and natural science. Someone, at some time, had cared about education here. She spent the morning cleaning, sweeping, washing windows until light flooded the room, arranging the books by subject, testing the stove which, to her relief, drew properly once she cleared birds' nests from the chimney pipe. By noon, when children began arriving in groups of 2 and 3, the schoolhouse looked almost welcoming. They came reluctantly, pushed forward by mothers who looked at Vivian with suspicion, or arrived alone, the older ones who worked in the mills and camps but were required by territory law to attend school until age 14. 23 children ranging from perhaps 5 years old to boys nearly grown, their clothes patched and stained, their faces showing the wariness of those who had learned early that life was hard and trust was earned. "Good afternoon," Vivian said, standing before them with her hands clasped, her voice steady despite her nervousness. I am Mrs. Carter, and I know some of you are wondering if a woman from Boston can teach you anything useful. That is a fair question. I propose we find out together. A boy of perhaps 12, tall for his age and already showing the muscle development of someone engaged in physical labor, raised his hand with exaggerated slowness. Can you teach us how to fall a tree without killing ourselves, Mum? 'Cause that's more useful than reading poems about daffodils. The other children laughed, but not unkindly. They were testing her, as children do with any new authority figure. I cannot, Vivian admitted, but I can teach you to calculate board feet, understand contracts so you know if you're being cheated, and write letters that will be taken seriously by people in power. I can teach you enough about human anatomy to know when a wound needs a doctor and when you can treat it yourself. I can teach you the history of how labor laws came to be and why they matter. And yes, I can teach you about daffodils, because beauty matters too, even here. Especially here. The boy considered this, then nodded slowly. Guess that might be worth knowing, he conceded. She divided them by rough ability rather than age, discovering that several of the older children could barely read, while some of the younger ones were already working through advanced arithmetic. They were not stupid, these mountain children. They were simply undereducated, their natural intelligence channeled into practical survival skills rather than academic knowledge. By the time the school day ended and the children dispersed to their various chores and jobs, Vivian felt the first stirrings of hope. They had been skeptical but not deliberately cruel. They had tested her, but also listened. It was more than she had expected. The infirmary was another matter entirely. That evening, as she inventoried supplies, a logger arrived supported by 2 companions, his hand wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, his face grey with pain. Caught it in the saw chain, one of his friends explained. Cut deep. Might lose the fingers. Vivian unwrapped the hand, her stomach churning at the damage, but her training overriding her revulsion. 2 fingers were mangled beyond saving, but 3 might be preserved with proper care. She had performed amputations before, assisting Thomas in his practice, but never alone, never with the patient's friends watching her every move with expressions that promised violence if she failed. I need to remove 2 fingers, she said calmly, looking directly at the injured man. I can save the others if we act quickly. It will hurt badly. Do I have your permission? The man, young beneath the grime and beard, met her eyes with surprising steadiness. Do what needs doing, Mom, just don't make me a cripple if you can help it. She worked quickly, using the limited supplies available, cleaning and cutting with hands that remained steady, even as her mind screamed at the barbaric conditions. The injured logger bit down on a leather strap and endured in silence, though sweat poured down his face, and his body trembled with shock. When she finished, bandaging the hand with clean cloth and administering what little laudanum the infirmary possessed, she stepped back and found a dozen men watching from the doorway, their expressions unreadable. Keep that hand clean and dry, she instructed. Change the dressing twice daily with boiled cloth. Come see me morning and evening for the next week. If you see red streaks moving up your arm or if fever develops, come immediately. Understand? Yes, Ma'am, the logger replied, his voice weak but grateful. Thank you, Ma'am. As the men helped him away, Clayton Morris appeared in the doorway, his expression slightly less contemptuous than before. Not bad for a city woman, he admitted grudgingly. Most would have fainted at the blood. I am a trained nurse, Mr. Morris. Blood does not frighten me. Incompetence does. He almost smiled. Maybe you'll last longer than a week after all, Mrs. Carter. That night, washing blood from her hands in the basin in her cabin, Vivian allowed herself to shake, to release the tension that she had held rigid throughout the surgery. She had proven something today, both to the camp and to herself. But she knew this was only the beginning. Acceptance here would be measured in countless small victories, and one mistake could erase all progress. As she lay in the darkness, she heard footsteps outside her cabin, heavy and deliberate. Through the gap in the curtains, she glimpsed a massive silhouette pausing for just a moment before moving on into the night. Elias Blackwood, checking on his new employee or something else? She could not tell, but the knowledge that he had been there, that he perhaps cared whether she succeeded or failed, brought an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the inadequate stove. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had survived her first day, and that was enough. The first snows arrived early that year, dusting the high peaks with white while the valleys still clung to autumn's fading warmth, a reminder that winter in the mountains was not a season, but a force of nature that demanded respect or claimed lives. 3 weeks had passed since Vivian's arrival, and the settlement had achieved an uneasy truce with her presence. She was no longer openly mocked, though neither was she welcomed. The children attended school with increasing regularity, drawn perhaps by curiosity or by lessons that actually seemed relevant to their lives. The injured logger's hand had healed without infection, earning her grudging acknowledgement from men who had expected her to fail. But acceptance remained elusive, particularly from the women who ran the cookhouse, the laundry, and the few households where families lived rather than solitary men. They whispered when she passed, fell silent when she approached, made clear through countless small gestures that she remained an outsider whose presence upset the established order of things. It was Constance Blackwood who orchestrated much of this Cold War, though she did so with such subtlety that proving anything would have been impossible. A comment here about Eastern women not understanding their place, a suggestion there that educated women made poor wives and worse mothers, a raised eyebrow when Vivian spoke during the occasional community gatherings that passed for social life in Timber Ridge. On this particular October morning, as frost painted intricate patterns on the schoolhouse windows and breath came in visible clouds, Vivian was teaching a lesson on basic engineering principles, explaining how forces and angles affected the fall of trees, when young Thomas Miller, the 12-year-old who had challenged her that first day, raised his hand. "Mrs. Carter, my pa says we're taking down the Widowmaker this week. That's the biggest Douglas fir in the valley, maybe 300 feet tall. He says it'll take 3 days just to cut through the trunk. Is that true?" "It could be, depending on the diameter and the hardness of the wood," Vivian replied, moving to the blackboard where she had drawn diagrams. "A tree that size might be 15 feet across at the base. Even with a cross-cut saw and 2 experienced men, you might only cut through a few inches per hour." "Can we watch?" a younger girl asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "Pa never lets us near when they're falling the big ones." Vivian hesitated. She had not witnessed a tree felling herself, though she had heard the distant thunder of giants hitting earth, felt the ground shake even from miles away. "For that matter," she said carefully, "I haven't seen it done either. Perhaps we could ask Mr. Morris if it would be safe to observe from a distance. It would be educational." The children's enthusiasm was infectious, and by noon Clayton Morris had grudgingly agreed that if they stayed well back and followed instructions precisely, they could watch from a ridge overlooking the valley where the massive fir stood like a sentinel from another age. The following morning, Vivian led her students along a muddy trail that climbed through forest so dense that sunlight barely penetrated, past stumps that spoke of previous harvests and standing trees that still waited their turn to feed the insatiable appetite of civilization. The air carried the sharp scent of pitch and the earthy smell of moss that carpeted every surface, thick as velvet and green as emeralds, even in the fading season. They reached the viewing ridge just as the cutting crew began their work. From this distance, perhaps a quarter mile, they could see the tree clearly, its trunk impossibly massive, its crown disappearing into low clouds that clung to the mountain peaks. At its base, men looked like children's toys, dwarfed by the living monument they intended to bring down. The foreman was explaining the process to his crew when a figure emerged from the forest below. And even at this distance, there was no mistaking Elias Blackwood. He moved with surprising grace for his size, stepping over obstacles that would have required smaller men to climb, his presence causing the crew to straighten and focus with renewed attention. "That's the owner," Thomas whispered to the younger children. "They say he can lift logs that take 4 normal men. They say he once carried an injured logger 5 miles through snow to save his life." "Hush," Vivian said gently, but she found herself watching Blackwood with the same fascination as her students. She had seen him only a handful of times since that first evening, always at a distance, always moving through his domain with that peculiar combination of power and restraint. The cutting began in earnest. 2 men on either end of a cross-cut, saw that must have been 12 feet long, pulling in perfect rhythm, while a third man drove wedges into the cut to prevent the saw from binding. The sound carried across the valley, a rhythmic song of steel against wood that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. Hours passed. The children grew restless. But Vivian kept them engaged by having them calculate the volume of wood being removed, estimate the tree's weight, discuss where and how it would fall. She was so focused on her teaching that she almost missed when Elias Blackwood suddenly shouted a warning that carried even to their distant position. The tree, it seemed, was not falling as planned. Something about the wind or the weight distribution had shifted, and instead of falling away from the crew into the cleared area, it was beginning to lean backward toward the men who had cut it. What happened next would be discussed in logging camps from Oregon to California for years afterward. Elias Blackwood, moving with speed that seemed impossible for someone his size, grabbed the nearest man and physically threw him clear of the danger zone. He reached for another, pulling him away by his coat collar. But the third man, frozen with terror, stood directly in the path of hundreds of tons of falling timber. Blackwood did not hesitate. He sprinted toward the paralyzed logger, covering ground that would have taken most men twice as long, reached him just as the tree began its final, inevitable descent, and dove forward, wrapping his massive arms around the smaller man and rolling them both clear of the trunk by mere seconds before it struck earth with a sound like thunder, shaking the ground so violently that Vivian and her students stumbled and sending a cloud of dirt and debris mushrooming into the air. Silence followed, broken only by the settling of branches and the sound of someone being sick behind a stump. Then the crew erupted in shouts, running toward their employer and the man he had saved, checking for injuries, laughing with the relief that comes after narrowly escaping death. From the ridge, Vivian found that she was trembling, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails had left marks in her palms. She had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not the physical feat itself, though that was remarkable enough, but the absolute lack of hesitation, the instinctive willingness to risk his own life for an employee who probably earned in a month what Blackwood made in an hour. The children were chattering excitedly, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance. Vivian's attention remained fixed on the scene below, where Blackwood was now standing, apparently uninjured, brushing dirt from his clothes, while his men surrounded him with the kind of loyalty that cannot be bought or demanded, but only earned through repeated demonstration of character. That evening, when the story had spread through the camp and grown with each retelling, until some versions had Blackwood catching the tree with his bare hands, Vivian found herself unable to focus on her usual evening routine of preparing lessons and treating minor injuries in the infirmary. She kept seeing that moment when he had run toward danger rather than away from it, kept thinking about what kind of man did such things without apparent thought for his own safety. She was sitting at her desk, staring at a page of notes that refused to make sense, when a knock sounded at her cabin door. Opening it, she found Elias Blackwood standing in the darkness, still wearing his work clothes, a fading bruise visible on his left cheek. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, surprised, "are you injured? Should I examine that bruise?" "It's nothing," he replied, his voice carrying that same quiet intensity she remembered from their first meeting. "I came to apologize. I heard you were watching from the ridge with the children. That must have been frightening." "It was educational," she replied, then added more honestly, "and yes, frightening, but also extraordinary. What you did today, that was remarkable." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to praise. "It was necessary. Any man would have done the same." "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but not every man would have moved fast enough or been strong enough to succeed. You saved a life today, Mr. Blackwood. That matters." He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable in the shadows cast by her lamp. "You surprise me, Mrs. Carter," he said finally. "Most educated women would have fainted, or at least complained about exposing children to such danger." "I am not most women," she replied, "and those children see danger every day. Better they understand it than fear it blindly." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful walls he maintained. "Would you walk with me?" he asked abruptly. "Just for a few minutes, there's something I'd like to show you. At this hour?" she asked, though she found herself already reaching for her shawl. "The nights are short now, and what I want to show you doesn't wait for convenient timing." She followed him through the settlement, past bunkhouses where men were already sleeping the exhausted sleep of those who labor with their bodies, past the main office building with its lighted windows where clerks worked late over ledgers and accounts. He led her to a trail that climbed steeply through the forest, saying nothing, his presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. They emerged onto a rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire valley, and what she saw stole her breath completely. The moon, nearly full, had risen above the mountains, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Below them, the cleared areas looked like patches in a quilt, irregular shapes surrounded by the dark mass of forest that stretched unbroken to the horizons. And everywhere, scattered through the darkness like fallen stars, were the orange pinpoints of fires from logging camps, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each representing men working to harvest the seemingly endless wealth of timber that covered these mountains. "This is what I built," Blackwood said quietly. "Not just the camps and the mills, but an entire economy. Thousands of men earn their living from this operation. Thousands of families depend on the decisions I make every day." "It's magnificent," Vivian said honestly. "And terrible." He glanced at her sharply. "Terrible. You're destroying something irreplaceable," she said, gesturing to the vast forest. "Those trees are centuries old. Once they're gone forever." "I know," he said, and there was unexpected pain in his voice. "Every tree I take down, I know it will never grow again, not in my lifetime or my children's or their children's. But people need lumber to build homes, to grow, to prosper. How do I balance that? How does anyone?" She had no answer for him. They stood in silence, watching the distant fires, and Vivian found herself intensely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his massive frame, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the sense that beneath his controlled exterior ran currents of thought and feeling as deep as any she had known. "Why did you really come to Timber Ridge, Mrs. Carter?" he asked suddenly. "A woman with your education could have found work anywhere, in better circumstances than this." "I needed to leave Boston," she replied carefully. "Staying meant accepting a future I couldn't tolerate." "What kind of future?" "One where I would be forever defined by my husband's death, pitied and patronized and gradually forgotten. Here at least I'm judged by what I do, not by what I've lost." He nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you might think." They returned to the settlement in companionable silence, and when they reached her cabin, he paused as if considering something, then simply nodded and walked away into the darkness, leaving her with more questions than answers, and a strange warmth that had nothing to do with her shawl or the stove waiting inside. October surrendered to November, bringing rain that turned roads to rivers of mud and made every task twice as difficult. But Vivian found herself settling into the rhythms of mountain life with surprising ease. The children had begun calling her Mrs. V, a nickname she had not encouraged, but found herself touched by nonetheless. Her classes expanded beyond basic literacy to include practical mathematics, enough science to understand why wounds festered and how to prevent it, and history that focused on labor movements and workers' rights, lessons that made some parents uncomfortable, but which Elias Blackwood, when approached about it, had defended with a simple statement that knowledge was never wasted. The infirmary saw a steady stream of patients, mostly minor injuries but occasional serious cases that tested her skills and her nerve. She had set broken bones, treated burns from steam engines, sewn countless wounds, and even delivered a baby when the camp's only midwife was too drunk to stand. Each success built her reputation, and each reputation grudgingly earned brought her closer to genuine acceptance. But Constance Blackwood's hostility had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified, fueled by something Vivian could not quite identify. The older woman found fault with everything, from the way Vivian dressed, too plain for someone in her position, to the subjects she taught, too radical for mountain children, to the time she spent in conversation with various camp residents, too familiar for a woman who should know her place. The breaking point came during the monthly community gathering, a Saturday evening affair, where the cookhouse was cleared of tables and transformed into something approaching a social hall. Families attended, along with single men desperate for any break from routine. Someone always brought a fiddle, someone else an accordion, and for a few hours, Timber Ridge almost resembled a real town rather than a collection of laborers temporarily bound by economic necessity. Vivian had not planned to attend, conscious of her outsider status, but several of the children had begged her to come, and their mothers, in a rare moment of warmth, had seconded the invitation. She wore her best dress, a modest creation of deep blue wool with a high collar and long sleeves, her hair arranged simply, her only jewelry a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother. The cookhouse was crowded and overheated, smelling of pine smoke, damp wool, and the residue of 1,000 meals cooked in industrial quantities. Music filled the space, not sophisticated by Boston standards, but enthusiastic and genuine, played by men whose hands were more accustomed to axes than instruments, but who coaxed melody from their tools with surprising skill. Clayton Morris approached her shortly after she arrived, his weathered face showing unusual animation, perhaps aided by the flask he kept pulling from his pocket. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his words only slightly slurred, "would you favor me with a dance?" She had not expected this, had not danced since Thomas's death, but the man's expression held such hopeful politeness that refusing seemed cruel. "I would be honored, Mr. Morris," she replied, taking his offered hand. They moved through a simple reel, nothing complicated, and Vivian found herself enjoying the exercise, the music, the rare moment of lightness in days that were usually filled with work and worry. When the dance ended, Morris bowed with exaggerated courtesy, and she returned to the periphery where the women congregated. But before she could reach them, a young logger named Samuel Reeves blocked her path, grinning with the confidence of someone who had no idea he was about to make a mistake. "My turn, Mrs. Carter," he said, reaching for her hand. She danced with him and then with another man, and then with Thomas Miller's father, who wanted to thank her for teaching his son to read well enough to understand the contracts he would sign someday. The attention was flattering but also uncomfortable, making her too visible, drawing exactly the kind of notice she had hoped to avoid. She did not see Constance approaching until the woman's voice cut through the music like a knife through silk. "How charming," Constance said loudly enough to be heard by half the room, "that our school teacher has decided to audition for a new position. Though I must say, Mrs. Carter, if you're seeking a husband among the workers, you might be more selective. Desperation is so unattractive." The music stumbled and died. Conversations ceased mid-word. Every eye in the cookhouse turned toward them, waiting to see how Vivian would respond to this public humiliation. She felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment, but from anger that she fought to control. "I was not aware, Mrs. Blackwood, that dancing with men who asked politely was inappropriate behavior. Perhaps you could explain what rules I've violated, so I might avoid future offense." "The rules of common decency," Constance replied, her pale eyes glittering with malice. "A proper widow does not make a spectacle of herself. But then perhaps standards in Boston are lower than I imagined." Before Vivian could respond, a voice spoke from the doorway, deep and carrying undeniable authority. "The only spectacle I see, cousin, is someone attempting to humiliate a guest in what should be a welcoming environment." Elias Blackwood entered the cookhouse, and the crowd parted before him like water around a stone. He was cleaned up from his usual work clothes, wearing dark trousers and a white shirt that emphasized his massive shoulders, his hair still damp from washing. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something that made even Constance hesitate. "Mrs. Carter was invited to attend this gathering by several families, myself included," he continued, moving through the crowd until he stood between Vivian and his cousin. "She has worked tirelessly for this community, caring for our sick, teaching our children, asking nothing in return beyond fair wages and basic respect. If she chooses to accept invitations to dance, that is her right and her business. I would suggest that anyone who disagrees take their concerns to me directly." The silence that followed was absolute. Constance's face had gone white with rage, but even she knew better than to challenge Blackwood's authority in front of the entire camp. She turned abruptly and left, her expensive skirt swishing with each furious step. Blackwood turned to the musicians. "I believe you were in the middle of a tune," he said mildly. "No reason to stop on my account." The music resumed hesitantly, then with growing confidence. Conversations started again, though Vivian could feel the weight of countless speculations, the gossip that would spread through the camp like wildfire. "Mrs. Carter," Blackwood said quietly, turning to face her fully, "would you honor me with a dance?" She stared at him, aware that accepting would fuel rumors, but aware also that refusing would suggest he had overstepped, would undermine the defense he had just offered. "I would be honored, Mr. Blackwood," she heard herself say. His hand, when he took hers, was rough with calluses and work-thickened skin, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He led her into a waltz, and despite his size, he moved with the confidence of someone who had been trained properly, probably in a life before logging camps and mountain timber. They danced without speaking, surrounded by people who were trying not to stare too obviously. Vivian was intensely aware of him, of his height that forced her to look up, of the strength in the arm that rested lightly at her waist, of the way his presence seemed to create a bubble of space around them that others instinctively respected. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the music. "Defend me, I mean. I can fight my own battles." "I know you can," he replied. "I've watched you do it for weeks. But sometimes having an ally makes the fight easier." "Why?" she asked. "Why would you make an enemy of your own family for someone you barely know?" He was silent for several measures, his expression thoughtful. "Because you're right," he said finally. "Because what you teach matters. Because my children will grow up in a world different from the one I knew, and they'll need the kind of education and thinking you offer. And because Constance was wrong to attack you that way, and someone needed to say so publicly." The dance ended, and he stepped back, releasing her hand with what might have been reluctance. "Thank you for the dance, Mrs. Carter," he said formally, then turned and left the cookhouse as abruptly as he had entered, leaving Vivian standing alone while whispers rose around her like smoke. She did not stay long after that. The evening had been ruined by confrontation, and her presence would only fuel more speculation. She walked back to her cabin through light rain that felt clean and cold against her overheated skin, her mind replaying the confrontation, the defense, the dance. She had just removed her shawl when another knock sounded. Opening the door, she half expected Blackwood, but instead found Sarah Reeves, Samuel's wife, standing in the rain. "Mrs. Carter," the woman said hesitantly, "I wanted to apologize for not speaking up when Mrs. Blackwood said those things, and to say thank you. My Samuel, he can barely read. You've been helping him in the evenings when you think no one notices. It matters. You matter. Don't let that bitter woman drive you away." Before Vivian could respond, Sarah pressed something into her hand, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and hurried away into the darkness. Vivian unwrapped it inside, finding a loaf of fresh bread still warm and a jar of preserved berries. Small gifts, but precious in a place where everything required effort and nothing was wasted. She sat at her desk, staring at the gifts, and allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been refusing to examine too closely. She was no longer simply surviving in Timber Ridge. She was beginning to belong. And more troubling still, she was beginning to care for the man who owned it, far more than wisdom suggested, was safe. Winter descended upon Timber Ridge with the inevitability of fate, transforming the mountain landscape into a realm of white silence where survival itself became a form of daily heroism. The first heavy snows arrived in mid-November, falling thick and relentless for 3 days until the world disappeared beneath a blanket that measured depth in feet rather than inches. Operations slowed but did not stop. Loggers worked in conditions that would have killed softer men, their breath freezing in beards that became masks of ice, their hands wrapped in rags beneath leather gloves that provided little protection against cold, that bit like living teeth. Vivian found her role expanding beyond teacher and nurse to something approaching essential personnel. Injuries increased with the hazardous conditions. Frostbite and hypothermia joined the usual catalogue of cuts, burns, and broken bones. She worked long hours in the infirmary that she had gradually transformed from neglected storage space into something resembling a proper medical facility, heated by a stove that required constant feeding, lit by lanterns that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with supplies she had ordered, using her own wages when camp provisions proved inadequate. The children still attended school, though less regularly, bundled in layers of wool and fur until they resembled small bears rather than humans. She adapted her teaching to accommodate irregular attendance, creating lessons that could be picked up at any point, focusing on practical skills that had immediate application in their daily struggles against the mountain winter. It was during one of these shortened school days, as Vivian was explaining the mathematics of calculating firewood needs based on temperature and duration, that young Mary Patterson raised her hand with unusual hesitation. "Mrs. V," she said quietly, using the nickname that had become universal among the students. "My mama is sick, real sick. Pa says it's just a cold, but she can't keep food down, and she's burning with fever. Could you maybe come look at her?" Vivian felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the recognition of potentially serious illness in circumstances where proper medical care was days away by difficult travel. "Of course, Mary. Take me to her as soon as school ends." The Patterson cabin sat at the edge of the settlement, smaller and more ramshackle than most, home to a family that barely scraped by even in good times. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sickness and inadequate ventilation. Mrs. Patterson lay on a narrow bed, her face flushed with fever, her breathing rapid and shallow. Vivian examined her with the thoroughness Thomas had taught her, noting the abdominal tenderness, the elevated pulse, the pattern of symptoms that suggested something far more serious than a simple cold. This woman needed surgery, needed it soon, or she would die of a ruptured appendix and the peritonitis that would inevitably follow. "Mr. Patterson," she said carefully to the worried man hovering nearby, "your wife needs a surgeon. The nearest one is in Portland, 3 days away in good weather, longer now with the snow. We need to get her there immediately." His face crumbled. "We can't afford that, Mrs. Carter. The trip alone would cost more than I make in a month, never mind doctor fees. She'll just have to ride it out." "She won't survive riding it out," Vivian said bluntly. "Without surgery, she'll be dead within days, maybe hours." "Then I guess she dies," he said, his voice breaking, "because I don't have the money to save her." Vivian left the cabin feeling physically ill with helpless rage. She knew what needed to be done, had assisted Thomas in enough appendectomies to understand the procedure. But attempting surgery here with inadequate tools and no proper anesthesia, in a cabin barely cleaner than a stable, seemed like madness. Yet doing nothing was certain death. She found herself walking toward the company office without conscious decision, her feet carrying her through deepening snow, while her mind wrestled with impossible choices. The office was warm and well lit, clerks working at their desks with the focused intensity of men whose work involved numbers rather than physical danger. Elias Blackwood's private office occupied the entire second floor, accessed by stairs that creaked under her weight. She knocked once, heard his deep voice call entrance, and opened the door to find him standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered operations, his massive frame silhouetted against the failing light. "Mrs. Carter," he said, turning with an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to concern. "What's wrong?" She explained the situation quickly, professionally, laying out the medical facts with clinical precision before adding, "I can perform the surgery myself. I've assisted in enough of them to know the procedure, but I need supplies we don't have, proper instruments, ether if possible, and I need your permission to use company resources." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "You've never done this alone." "No. If she dies, they'll blame you, might even try to charge you with something." "I know. And if you do nothing, she dies anyway, but without hope." He moved to his desk, pulling out paper and writing quickly. "Take this to the company store. Get whatever you need, send the bill to me personally. I'll have the cookhouse boil water and send clean linens. Anything else?" "A prayer might help," she said, attempting lightness that fell flat. "I'm not much for praying," he replied, "but I'll do something better. I'll assist you. Extra hands are always useful in surgery, and I've seen enough battlefield medicine to know the basics." She stared at him, recognizing what he was offering. If things went wrong, his presence would link him to the failure, would compromise his authority, would make him share in whatever blame attached to her decisions. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Neither do you," he replied. "But we're going to anyway. Come on, we're wasting time." The surgery, conducted on the Pattersons' kitchen table after it had been scrubbed with lye soap and boiling water, lasted 3 hours that felt like 3 years. Vivian worked with hands that remained steady despite her racing heart, opening the abdomen with a razor she had boiled sterile, locating the inflamed appendix that was hours away from rupturing, removing it with care that came from knowledge and desperation in equal measure. Eliza stood across from her, his size making him seem impossibly large in the cramped cabin. but his hands were steady as he held lanterns and handed her instruments and kept the curious and terrified family members at bay with quiet authority. He did not flinch at the blood, did not question her decisions, simply provided the support she needed exactly when she needed it. When she finally closed the incision with stitches that would have made her late husband proud, Vivian felt her legs begin to shake with delayed reaction. Mrs. Patterson's color was better already, her breathing steadier, though she remained unconscious from the ether. "She'll live," Vivian said, surprised by how hoarse her voice sounded. "If infection doesn't set in, if the stitches hold, if a dozen other things go right, she'll recover." "You did well," Elias said quietly. "Thomas would have been proud." She looked up sharply. "How do you know about Thomas? I know everything about everyone who works for me," he replied without apology. "Your husband was a good man who died too young. You honored his memory tonight." They left the cabin together, stepping out into night that had fallen while they worked, into cold so intense it hurt to breathe. Snow was falling again, thick flakes that muffled sound and obscured vision beyond a few feet. "Thank you," Vivian said, stopping to face him despite the cold. "For your help, for your trust, for not letting her die because of money." He looked down at her, his face barely visible in the darkness, snowflakes catching in his dark hair and beard. "I told you before, Mrs. Carter, you surprise me constantly. Tonight you became more than a teacher or a nurse. Tonight you became indispensable." There was something in his voice that made her pulse quicken, a warmth that had nothing to do with exertion or the aftermath of crisis. They stood very close in the falling snow, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the frost forming on his breath, notice the way his eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense. "Elias," she said, using his given name for the first time. "Why do you care so much? About me, about what happens here?" "Because for the first time in longer than I can remember," he said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep, "this place feels like it could be more than just a business. Because you make me remember that there are things worth building besides fortunes. Because when I watch you work, I see someone who hasn't forgotten how to hope, and I'd forgotten that was even possible." Before she could respond, before she could examine what his words meant or acknowledge what she was feeling, he stepped back, breaking the moment. "Get some rest, Mrs. Carter. You've earned it." He walked away into the snow, leaving her standing alone with her heart pounding and her mind full of questions she wasn't ready to answer. December brought cold that could kill in minutes and beauty that could steal breath, a combination that defined mountain life as surely as any words could capture. Mrs. Patterson survived, defying the odds and the skeptics who had whispered that city medicine had no place in mountain reality. Her recovery became a turning point, not just for Vivian's reputation, but for her acceptance within the community. Women who had maintained careful distance now brought her small gifts, jars of preserves and knitted mittens, offerings that spoke of gratitude and grudging respect. But the surgery had consequences beyond medical success. It had created a bond between Vivian and Elias that was obvious to anyone with eyes to see. They were not conducting a romance, nothing so scandalous as that. But they sought each other's company with increasing frequency, conversing in the evenings after the day's work was complete, sharing meals in the cookhouse, where his presence beside her became expected rather than remarkable. He told her about his past, about growing up in Philadelphia as the son of a shipping merchant who had expected him to follow into the family business, about his decision to go west instead, seeking something he could not articulate but would know when he found it. He had worked as a logger himself initially, learning the business from the bottom up, saving every penny until he could buy his first timber claim. He had built his fortune through shrewd decisions and willingness to risk everything on his judgment, creating an empire that now employed thousands and generated wealth that would have satisfied most men. But wealth had not brought happiness, he admitted one evening, as they sat in his office reviewing supply orders for the winter. Success without meaning is just accumulation. I kept thinking the next deal, the next expansion, would be the one that made it all worthwhile. But it never was. "What would make it worthwhile?" she asked. "Building something that lasts beyond me," he said, "creating opportunities for people like the Pattersons, who work themselves to death and still can't get ahead. Maybe funding schools across the territory, real ones with proper teachers and supplies. Maybe conservation efforts to ensure the forests aren't completely destroyed. I don't know exactly. I just know that dying as the richest man in the graveyard sounds empty. She found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, about her marriage to Thomas that had been built on respect and shared interests but never passion, about the relief she had felt alongside grief when he died, guilt over being freed by death from a life that had slowly suffocated her expectations, about her fear that she was incapable of feeling the kind of love poets wrote about, that perhaps she was too practical, too educated, too damaged by loss. Or perhaps, Elias suggested quietly, you simply hadn't met the right person yet. Their hands had been resting on the desk, separated by mere inches. His moved slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, until his fingers covered hers with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so large and powerful. "Vivian," he said, her name on his lips sending warmth through her, despite the cold that seeped through every crack in the building. "I know this is complicated. I know there are 100 reasons why this is a terrible idea, but I need you to know that what I feel, it's not gratitude for good work or respect for your abilities, though I feel both those things. It's more than that." She should have withdrawn her hand, should have reminded him of propriety and social conventions, and the impossibility of anything between a wealthy owner and his employee. Instead, she turned her hand beneath his, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that felt simultaneously natural and revolutionary. "I feel it too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Good," he said, a slight smile touching his lips. "If you weren't terrified, I'd worry about your judgment." They sat that way for long minutes, hands joined, words unnecessary, until the sound of someone climbing the stairs forced them apart. The spell broken but not forgotten, they returned to the pretense of reviewing ledgers, while a clerk delivered reports that neither would remember later. But Constance had not been idle during these weeks. She had watched the growing connection between her cousin and the teacher, with increasing alarm, recognizing a threat not just to her influence, but to her carefully constructed position as the settlement's social arbiter. She had already lost one battle publicly, had been humiliated in front of the entire community when Elias defended Vivian at the dance. She would not lose the war. She began gathering information, questioning the clerks who handled correspondence, speaking with contacts in Portland and even Boston, building a case file on Vivian Carter's past with the thoroughness of someone conducting a campaign. What she found exceeded her hopes. A piece of information so explosive that, deployed correctly, it would destroy Vivian's reputation and force her departure without Elias being able to prevent it. A letter had arrived in November, forwarded through several hands before reaching Timber Ridge, sent by a lawyer in Boston handling estate matters. Vivian had never received it because Constance, through careful bribery of a clerk whose gambling debts made him vulnerable to pressure, had intercepted it. The letter contained information about Thomas Carter's death, information that painted a very different picture than the story of fever taking a devoted husband. Dr. Thomas Carter, the letter explained with the lawyer's usual dispassionate language, had indeed died of fever. But it was fever contracted in a brothel during one of his frequent visits to establishments his wife presumably knew nothing about. His debts, the letter continued, included substantial sums owed to these establishments, gambling halls, and several women who claimed he had made promises he never intended to keep. The estate, such as it was, had been insufficient to cover these obligations, and creditors were still seeking restitution from any available source. Constance read the letter with growing satisfaction, recognizing its potential. Vivian might be innocent of her husband's behaviors, but association with such scandal would be enough. In a community as isolated and gossip-driven as Timber Ridge, reputation was everything. A woman connected, however unwillingly, to brothels and gambling debts would be untenable as a teacher, impossible as a romantic prospect for someone of Elias's standing. She waited for the perfect moment to deploy her weapon, and it came the week before Christmas, during a community meeting to discuss plans for a holiday celebration. These gatherings had become more frequent as Vivian's educational efforts bore fruit, transforming a collection of isolated individuals into something approaching genuine community. Elias stood at the front of the cookhouse, discussing plans for a Christmas feast and gifts for the children, his manner relaxed and almost cheerful in a way Constance had not seen in years. Vivian sat nearby, contributing suggestions with the confidence of someone who had earned her place at the table. Constance rose during a pause in the discussion, her face arranged in an expression of concerned reluctance. "Before we finalize these plans," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowded room, "I feel compelled to address a matter that has come to my attention, a matter concerning Mrs. Carter's suitability to continue in her position." The room fell silent. Vivian's face went pale as she recognized the attack beginning. "What matter?" Elias asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Information regarding her late husband's character and the circumstances of his death," Constance said, producing the letter with theatrical timing. "Information that suggests Mrs. Carter's background is not what she represented to us." She read the letter aloud, every damning detail, watching Vivian's face crumble with humiliation, while the crowd's expressions shifted from shock to judgment. When she finished, the silence was absolute. Vivian sat frozen, her mind unable to process the violation, the public destruction of what remained of her marriage's memory, the exposure of shame she had fled Boston to escape. She had known about Thomas's infidelities, had lived with that knowledge in silent misery, but she had never known the full extent of his betrayals, had never imagined that even in death he would continue to ruin her life. She stood slowly, her dignity the only thing she had left. "I did not know the details, Mrs. Blackwood has shared," she said, her voice steady despite the tears she refused to shed. "But I will not defend myself against my dead husband's actions. If the community feels I am unsuitable to continue in my position, I will depart at first opportunity." She walked from the cookhouse with her head high, through a crowd that parted before her like water, into the winter night where cold seemed merciful compared to the judgment she had just endured. Behind her, Elias Blackwood stood motionless, his face a mask of fury directed at his cousin, while his heart told him to follow Vivian, but his mind reminded him that doing so now would only fuel more gossip and make her situation worse. Constance smiled, satisfied that the threat had been neutralized and her position secured, not realizing that she had just made the worst miscalculation of her life. The cabin felt colder than it ever had before, though the stove burned with the same intensity as always, as if humiliation generated its own particular species of chill that no fire could warm. Vivian packed her belongings with mechanical precision, folding clothes that had become worn from mountain use, wrapping the medical instruments she had purchased with her own funds, stacking the books she had brought from Boston, believing they would be her companions through lonely nights. Everything fit into the same 2 trunks she had arrived with, a depressing testament to how little she had accumulated in months of labor that had consumed her completely. She had no plan beyond departure. The stagecoach would come in 3 days, assuming the roads remained passable, and she would ride it down the mountain to whatever future awaited women of ruined reputation and empty pockets. Perhaps she could find work in Portland, far enough from Boston that her name meant nothing, close enough to civilization that educated women were less remarkable. Perhaps she would simply disappear into the anonymous masses of people who had tried and failed to reinvent themselves in the West. A knock at her door interrupted these bleak contemplations. She opened it expecting one of the women, come either to gloat or offer awkward comfort, but instead found young Thomas Miller standing in the snow, his face red from cold or emotion or both. "Mrs. V," he said without preamble, his voice cracking with adolescent uncertainty, "we heard you're leaving. The kids, we made you something, wanted to give it to you before you went." He thrust a package wrapped in brown paper into her hands and fled before she could respond, his boots leaving deep prints in fresh snow as he ran back toward the settlement center. Vivian closed the door and unwrapped the package with hands that trembled slightly. Inside was a book, handmade from scavenged paper and cardboard, bound with careful stitches that showed more enthusiasm than skill. The cover bore a title in careful lettering, "Stories of Timber Ridge" by Mrs. V's students. Each page contained a story or drawing, contributions from every child she had taught, illustrations of their lives in the logging camp, mixed with tales of adventure and hope that her lessons had encouraged them to imagine. Mary Patterson had written a story about a brave nurse who saved lives in impossible circumstances. Samuel Reeves's youngest sister had drawn a picture of Vivian teaching, surrounded by children whose faces showed concentration and joy. Thomas himself had contributed an essay about the importance of education, arguing with surprising eloquence that knowledge was as valuable as physical strength in building a better future. She sat on the cot, clutching the book, and allowed herself to weep for the first time since the meeting. Not from shame over her husband's betrayals, not from anger at Constance's cruelty, but from the recognition of what she was losing. These children had become more than students. They represented possibility, proof that she could make a difference, evidence that her life had meaning beyond simply surviving. A second knock interrupted her tears. This time, it was Sarah Reeves, accompanied by 3 other women whose names Vivian knew but whose homes she had never entered. They carried a basket covered with a cloth that smelled of fresh bread. "We wanted to say," Sarah began hesitantly, "that what your husband did, that's not your fault. Most of us have been married to men who disappointed us in one way or another. Doesn't mean we deserved it, and doesn't mean you deserved what Constance did to you. She's been trying to push you out since you arrived," another woman added. "Not because you did anything wrong, but because she saw you as competition, for influence, for respect, maybe for other things too. We want you to know," Sarah continued, "that if you choose to stay, you'd have friends here. Real ones. People who see what you've done for this place and appreciate it." Vivian looked at these women, their faces weathered by hard work and harder lives, their hands calloused from labor that never ended, their eyes showing the kind of practical wisdom that comes from surviving circumstances that would have destroyed softer people. They were offering her something precious, acceptance without judgment, solidarity that crossed social boundaries. "I don't know if staying is possible," she said quietly. "My position here depends on community confidence. How can I teach children when their parents question my character?" "Your character ain't in question with anyone who matters," Sarah replied firmly. "As for Constance, she's never had children of her own, never done the hard work of raising a family in this place. She married money and thinks that makes her better than us. But we decide who teaches our children, not her." Before Vivian could respond, male voices sounded outside, raised in argument. Through her window she could see a group of loggers confronting Clayton Morris in the street, their postures aggressive, their words indistinct but clearly heated. "That would be our husbands," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Seems they have opinions about all this too." The confrontation outside grew louder, more men joining until perhaps 50 loggers faced the foreman, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with his assigned role as company spokesman. The argument lasted nearly an hour, voices rising and falling, punctuated by gestures and occasional shoves that never quite escalated to violence. Finally, Morris threw up his hands in apparent surrender and stalked toward the company office, the crowd following at his heels like an angry river following its channel. What Vivian did not see was the meeting in Elias Blackwood's office, where Morris delivered a message that was equal parts threat and plea. "The men won't work if she leaves," Morris said bluntly. "Half of them have wives or children who have been treated by her. The other half have seen what she's done for this place. They're saying that if Constance can destroy a woman's life over her dead husband's mistakes, then none of them are safe either. They're talking about walking out, Mr. Blackwood. All of them." Elias sat behind his desk, his massive frame tense with controlled rage that had been building since the meeting. "Let me be clear, Clayton," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I did not authorize my cousin to intercept private correspondence or conduct investigations into my employees' personal histories. Mrs. Carter's work here has been exemplary. Her husband's failings, whatever they were, have no bearing on her abilities or her character. So she stays. She stays if she chooses to. But first I need to deal with Constance." The confrontation between cousins occurred in the main office, with clerks trying unsuccessfully to pretend they weren't listening to every word through the thin walls of the second floor. "You had no right," Elias said, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that was more frightening than shouting. "No right to interfere with private mail, no right to conduct investigations behind my back, and no right to destroy a woman's reputation to satisfy your own insecurities." Constance stood her ground, though her face had paled at his tone. I had every right to protect this company's reputation. That woman was making us a laughingstock, a refined teacher pretending she belonged among rough laborers, and you, cousin, were making yourself foolish over her. My personal feelings are none of your concern, he replied, but since you've made them your business, let me be perfectly clear. Mrs. Carter has accomplished more in 3 months than you have in 3 years. She saved a woman's life with surgery. I'm not sure any city doctor could have performed under those conditions. She's educated children who would otherwise grow up illiterate. She's treated hundreds of injuries and prevented countless infections. What exactly have you done, Constance, besides spread gossip and make people miserable? How dare you, she hissed, after everything I've done for you, managing this settlement, maintaining standards, keeping things civilized. You've maintained control, not civilization, he corrected. There's a difference, and as of this moment, your position here is terminated. I'll provide you with generous settlement and arrange passage to Portland or wherever else you'd like to go, but you will leave Timber Ridge and you will not return. You can't be serious, she said, genuine shock breaking through her anger. This is my home. I've lived here for 5 years. You've occupied space here, he replied. But you've never understood what makes a place a home. That requires caring about people beyond what they can do for you. Now get out of my office. We're done. Constance left with whatever dignity she could salvage, but her departure was watched by dozens of eyes that showed no sympathy, only satisfaction that justice had finally caught up with cruelty. That evening, as snow fell thick and silent over the settlement, Elias walked to Vivian's cabin and knocked with the same careful gentleness he applied to everything despite his size. She opened the door, her face showing the ravages of tears and sleepless worry, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Constance is leaving, he said without preamble. She'll be gone within the week. Your position here is secure for as long as you want it. The men made their feelings clear, and so did many of the women. This place needs you, Vivian. I need you. She stepped aside to let him enter, closing the door against the cold. I appreciate your intervention, she said carefully. But Elias, what she said about Thomas, it was all true. He did die in a brothel. He did accumulate debts I knew nothing about. I wasn't lying about my past, but I wasn't entirely honest either. You were honest about everything that mattered, he replied. You didn't volunteer information about painful private matters. That's called dignity, not deception. Your husband's failures don't define you, Vivian. Your own actions do, and your actions have been remarkable from the moment you arrived here. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the determination in his dark eyes, feel the warmth that radiated from him like heat from a forge. I told you before that what I feel isn't just gratitude or respect. I need you to understand what I'm saying. I love you. I've probably loved you since that first day when you stood in the wilderness garden and talked about things deserving to be remembered. I know it's too soon. I know there are complications, but I can't watch you leave without telling you the truth. Vivian felt something break loose inside her chest, some frozen place that had been locked since Thomas's death, maybe since before then. Elias, she whispered. I'm terrified of this. I'm feeling this way, of trusting it. So am I, he admitted, but I'd rather be terrified and honest than safe and alone. She reached up, her hand touching his bearded cheek, feeling the roughness of his skin and the steadiness of his presence. I don't want to leave, she said quietly. I want to stay, with you, despite everything. He pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home, his arms surrounding her with gentle strength, his heart beating steady against her ear. They stood that way for long minutes, holding each other while snow fell outside, and the future stretched before them, uncertain, but no longer quite so frightening. Christmas came to Timber Ridge with a joy that surprised everyone who had lived through the previous months of tension and transformation. Constance departed on a clear morning, 3 days before the holiday, her departure witnessed by exactly no one, the settlement collectively deciding that farewells would be hypocritical. Her absence left a vacuum that was quickly filled by genuine community rather than enforced hierarchy, by people organizing celebrations and making decisions cooperatively rather than waiting for authoritarian direction. Vivian remained, her position not just secured, but strengthened by the confrontation that had nearly destroyed her. The children returned to school with renewed enthusiasm, and more families began attending the informal evening classes she offered for adults, teaching basic literacy and mathematics to men and women who had never had the opportunity for education. But the real change was in her relationship with Elias, which had moved from careful friendship to acknowledged courtship, with a speed that scandalized no one in a community that understood mountain life left little room for lengthy social rituals. They were together openly now, taking meals side by side in the cookhouse, walking the settlement paths in the evenings, spending long hours in his office where they discussed not just camp operations, but dreams for what Timber Ridge could become. He was teaching her the business side of logging, showing her the ledgers that tracked every penny, explaining the complex negotiations with buyers in Portland and San Francisco, sharing his concerns about sustainable practices that balanced profit with conservation. She, in turn, shared her vision for expanding education, for creating a real school that could serve not just Timber Ridge but surrounding camps, for establishing a proper medical clinic that could handle more than just emergency care. It was during one of these evening planning sessions, as January cold pressed against the windows and the stove radiated welcome warmth, that Elias produced a small box from his desk drawer with the kind of nervous hesitation that seemed impossible from someone so large and confident. "I know this is quick by conventional standards," he said, his deep voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I know people will talk, will say we haven't known each other long enough. But I also know that mountain life is short and uncertain, and I don't want to waste time pretending I feel less than I do." He opened the box, revealing a ring of elegant simplicity, a single sapphire set in gold, the kind of piece that spoke of substantial resources deployed with restraint and taste. "Vivian Carter, will you marry me? Will you take on this complicated life, this rough place, this man who comes with more baggage than most? Will you help me build something that matters here, something that lasts beyond timber and profit?" She looked at the ring, then at his face, seeing vulnerability that he rarely showed, hope mixed with fear of rejection, the kind of naked emotion that made her heart ache with tenderness. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it. To the complications and the roughness and the baggage. Yes to building something that lasts. Yes to you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled her into his arms with a fierce joy that lifted her completely off her feet, spinning her in a circle, while she laughed with pure happiness for the first time since she couldn't remember when. They were married in February, during a brief warm spell that melted enough snow to make travel possible, allowing the circuit preacher who served the mountain settlements to reach Timber Ridge on his quarterly rounds. The ceremony took place in the cookhouse, decorated with pine branches and whatever early flowers could be coaxed from the limited greenhouse some enterprising soul had constructed. The entire settlement attended, loggers in their cleanest work clothes standing beside families dressed in their best, children fidgeting with excitement, women dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Clayton Morris gave Vivian away with gruff affection, having evolved from skeptical critic to genuine ally. Sarah Reeves stood as her attendant, wearing a dress that had been hastily altered to fit the occasion. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional, but when Elias slipped a gold band onto Vivian's finger to join the sapphire engagement ring, and when she placed a matching band on his massive hand, the symbolism transcended the ordinary. These were two people who had found each other against improbable odds, who had overcome scandal and social barriers, who represented something larger than individual happiness. The celebration that followed lasted until the early hours, with music and dancing and food that exceeded even the usual generosity of camp meals. Vivian danced with Elias, with the children who had become her students and friends, with loggers who had started as hostile strangers and become something approaching family. She accepted congratulations from people who months ago would not have acknowledged her existence and saw in their faces genuine happiness for her unexpected fortune. But not everyone celebrated. In Portland, where news traveled slowly but inevitably, Constance Blackwood received word of the marriage with a fury that consumed rational thought. She had not simply lost position and influence. She had been replaced by the very woman she had tried to destroy, humiliated in a way that made her previous defeat pale by comparison. She began making inquiries, spending money she could ill afford on private investigators and lawyers, searching for some legal mechanism to challenge the marriage, to reclaim her position, to exact revenge on the cousin who had cast her out, and the upstart teacher who had stolen what Constance believed was rightfully hers. What she discovered was both more and less than she had hoped for. There was no legal basis to challenge the marriage itself. But there were other avenues, darker methods, ways to destroy what Elias and Vivian were building without directly confronting them. She made contact with timber barons who competed with Blackwood Lumber, men who would pay handsomely for information about operations, contracts, and expansion plans. She reached out to radical labor organizers who were always seeking ways to infiltrate successful operations and stir unrest. She began a letter-writing campaign to territorial authorities, suggesting safety violations and environmental concerns that would trigger investigations and slow operations. Meanwhile, in Timber Ridge, Vivian settled into her new role as Mrs. Blackwood with surprising ease. She continued teaching, continued treating the sick and injured, but now she also assumed responsibilities for camp management that Constance had jealously guarded. She proved to have a natural talent for organization and negotiation, improving working conditions through practical changes that cost little but meant much to the men who labored in dangerous circumstances. She established a lending library, soliciting book donations from churches and organizations in Portland. She organized a camp newspaper, teaching the older students journalism while giving everyone a voice in documenting their experiences. She worked with Elias to implement safety protocols that reduced injuries significantly and to create a profit-sharing system that gave workers stake in the operation's success. Under their joint leadership, Timber Ridge transformed from a typical logging camp, transitory and rough, into something approaching a real community, a place where families wanted to settle rather than simply endure temporary hardship. Production actually increased as worker satisfaction improved, proving that treating people with dignity and respect was good business as well as simple morality. But trouble was coming, though they did not yet recognize the signs. Labor organizers began appearing at the edges of the camp, talking to disgruntled workers and stirring resentment among those who felt they deserved more. Equipment began experiencing mysterious failures, minor sabotages that caused delays and expense. Rumors circulated about safety violations and environmental damage, bringing territorial inspectors who found nothing substantially wrong but whose investigations disrupted operations and created tension. It was Clayton Morris who first connected the pattern of troubles to a common source. "Boss," he said one evening in Elias's office, his weathered face showing unusual concern, "I've been hearing things. Talk in Portland about someone spreading stories about us, paying people to cause problems here. Word is it might be your cousin, though I can't prove it." Elias exchanged glances with Vivian, who sat beside him reviewing medical supply orders. "Constance," he said quietly, "I should have known she wouldn't accept defeat gracefully." "What do we do?" Vivian asked. "We protect what we've built," he replied, his voice carrying the determination that had built his empire. "We document everything. We tighten security. We make sure our workers know the truth about what's happening, and we prepare for whatever she's planning next, because I guarantee she's not done yet." As spring approached, bringing with it the busiest season of the logging year, Timber Ridge stood at a crossroads. It had become something remarkable, a testament to what was possible when people worked together toward common goals. But it was also vulnerable, threatened by forces that would destroy it, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways that challenged conventional power structures. The real battle was only beginning. Spring arrived with a force that transformed the world overnight. Ice melted into racing rivers. The pale green of new needles shimmered through the blackened stumps, and Timber Ridge hummed with renewed purpose. Vivian awoke each morning to the joyful cacophony of returning birds, to children practicing their lessons outside in warming sunlight, to the more distant but ever-present timber saws roaring to life once more. But beneath the surface, trouble brewed. Constance's campaign had begun to bear its poisonous fruit. Labor organizers, some legitimate, others little more than hired rabble-rousers, sought fertile ground in the small grievances that persisted among the crew. Minor equipment mishaps now occurred twice as often, and rumors swirled about sabotage initiated by men smart enough to hide their tracks. Whispers about labor abuses and environmental damage reached government agents in Portland, triggering endless inspections that slowed output and established a climate of suspicion. Vivian responded in her usual fashion, with steady hands and clear eyes. She shifted her teaching to include more about citizenship, about dignity in the face of adversity, about the power and risk of collective action. Elias countered the outside agitators not with threats, but by opening his books to the workers, explaining exactly where the company's profits went, proving the new profit-sharing plan would soon bring returns for the men themselves. Clayton Morris, skeptical as ever but fiercely loyal to Timber Ridge, led a series of community meetings, encouraging the workers to voice complaints and solutions openly. Still, the pressure built. When a nighttime fire destroyed one of the vital tool shacks, costing the operation precious time, money, and nearly the lives of 2 watchmen, panic flared. Elias organized a volunteer fire watch. Vivian tended the burns and smoke inhalation cases, and for the first time the threat of real violence shadowed the peaceful settlement. One evening, after another long day of work, Vivian received an anonymous note, slid beneath the schoolhouse door in crude block letters. "Leave while you still can. The next fire will be your husband's house." She brought the note directly to Elias, who read it and quietly tore it in half. "If they want a war," he said, "they've picked the wrong mountain." That night, he and Vivian sat beside the dying fire, devising strategies. They decided to triple the fire watch, install secure locks, organize community patrols, and, with some reluctance, purchase firearms for the most trusted men. Vivian objected to weapons, but Elias insisted, "This is not about fighting, it's about making them think twice before turning a threat into harm." On the third night of the patrol, Clayton apprehended a saboteur in the act, a former logger dismissed months earlier for theft, now paid by an intermediary whose letters bore a Portland address. Under questioning, and with the promise of leniency rather than violence, the man confessed everything. It led back, as they suspected, to Constance's new business associates, rival timber barons eager to bring down Blackwood's more enlightened operation, afraid that successful reforms would inspire workers all over the region. To protect Timber Ridge legally, Elias sent emissaries to Portland, hiring trusted lawyers to expose the web of sabotage. Vivian, meanwhile, penned an open letter, published in 3 area newspapers, detailing in unsentimental terms what was happening in Timber Ridge, documenting the changes brought to working and living conditions, calling out misinformation, and inviting representatives from the workers' own families to tour the camp and see for themselves. The turning point came at a tense town meeting. Elias stood before the men and women of Timber Ridge, trailed by Vivian, Clayton, and several elder loggers. "They want fear to divide us," he told them. "But we have built something stronger than fear. You do not work for me, you work with me. You are not simply employees. You are owners in what Timber Ridge has become and what it's becoming." Vivian spoke only once near the end. "This is where I found my place, the first I have truly called home since I was a girl. If you defend nothing else, defend the truth of your own lives from those who profit by poisoning it." Her words, spoken quietly, but with a conviction that carried even to the sullen troublemakers at the back, marked a turning. By the time the labor negotiators arrived, looking for conflict, they found not a volatile mob, but a determined, unified community who greeted them with facts, fair paybooks, and dozens of testimonies from men and women whose lives had been transformed by what Timber Ridge had become. Portland's legal system, pressed from both ends, began to turn against the conspirators. The saboteur's confession, combined with evidence collected by Elias's lawyers and journalist allies Vivian had cultivated, connected the attacks to Constance's new partners. The rivals backed off, unwilling to risk prosecution or public scandal. News arrived that Constance, ruined financially and socially, had left Portland for California, leaving behind debt and a reputation too tattered even for the city's least reputable circles. Peace returned, but it was a peace forged by hard effort and shared risk, one that left Timber Ridge forever changed. The labor agitation died down, the equipment mishaps ceased. Even old rivalries among workers softened as new realities set in. Elias and Vivian, though exhausted, stood side by side on the high ridge overlooking the camp, seeing not just the present, but the shape of a future they'd nearly lost. She pressed his hand, thinking of all they'd survived, and knowing finally that they could withstand any trouble so long as they faced it together. Years passed, and the story of Timber Ridge, forged in hardship, scandal, and the stubborn determination of its people, spread far beyond the Cascade Mountains. The small community, once considered just another logging outpost, became a model for humane practices in an industry long known for exploitation. Other camps emulated its profit-sharing model, its open schools, and its emphasis on safety, not because of idealism, but because, under Elias and Vivian's management, prosperity and decency had proven compatible. The children Vivian once taught now worked as foremen, mechanics, and teachers themselves, their voices carrying the legacy of her patience and belief in their potential. Many families chose to stay even after the timber harvest slowed, transforming the once temporary camp into a real town, with a permanent church and town hall, a medical clinic, and the library Vivian had worked so hard to establish. The old company cookhouse became a community center, famous for its nightly pies and Sunday dances. Vivian and Elias had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up as comfortable with a ledger as a crosscut saw, as fluent in poetry as in practical geometry. The family lived in the same cabin, now expanded and filled with books, mementos, and the endless energy of growing children. Vivian continued teaching at the school she'd helped found for as long as her health allowed, leaving the running of the clinic to a former student who had become one of the best nurses in the territory. Elias remained a legendary figure, giant, gentle, and generous, introducing new selective logging methods and planting hundreds of trees for every dozen felled. He never forgot the lesson of those early hardships. Leadership was not domination, but service. He kept his promises to pay fair wages, to be transparent, to place the safety and dignity of his people first, no matter what the market demanded from him. When outsiders asked the secret of Timber Ridge's success, locals pointed to the two, so different in origin but inseparable in purpose, who'd believed not only in each other, but in the possibility of something better for everyone. The story of the city girl and the mountain giant, spread in letters, church sermons, and even the occasional newspaper article, always growing with each retelling, but never losing its core. Love, courage, and commitment can outlast any storm. One autumn, already grey-haired and slow in movement, Vivian wandered the ridge at sunset holding the hand of her eldest daughter. She looked out over what she and Elias had built and felt a peace as deep as the river valleys below. "It was never easy," she murmured, "but it was worth every risk. There's nothing in this world a good heart and an honest partner cannot stand up to, not even the mountains themselves." Her daughter squeezed her hand and looked out at Timber Ridge, where laughter drifted from the harvest festival, and lamplight glowed golden among the pines. "You're right, Mama," she said softly. "You and Papa built more than a town. You built a world." And among the endless forests and ever-circling seasons, the city girl and her giant lumberjack endured, not as legends, but as proof that the wildest hearts can choose to root down and change the mountain, and even, by example, the world.